Imagine for a moment a small brown book, no bigger than your hand, its cover worn soft at the corners from being slipped in and out of pockets, handbags, and kitchen drawers for 14 long years. Inside, rows of little squares, each one a permission slip for something you and I would take entirely for granted today. A pat of butter, a spoonful of sugar, a single egg, a quarter pound of bacon to last a family of 5 for 7 days. This was the ration book, and on the 4th of July, 1954, at the stroke of midnight, it became at last a relic, a piece of history, a small brown souvenir of the longest, strangest, most patient 14 years Britain had ever known. Tonight, we are going to travel back together, back to that summer, back to the corner shops and the high streets, to the butcher's counters and the grocer's scales, back to the queues that had become a way of life, back to the kitchens where mothers had performed small miracles for a decade and a half, stretching a scrap of meat across a Sunday table, making a cake from dried egg and a whisper of margarine. We're going back to meet the people who lived through it and to stand beside them on the day it finally came to an end. So settle in. Pour yourself a cup of tea if you like. Draw the curtains against the evening. And let me tell you the story of the day Britain got its freedom back. To understand what ended on that July morning in 1954, we must first understand what began many years earlier on a grey Monday in January 1940. The war was only 4 months old. The first winter of the Second World War had been one of the coldest in memory. Rivers froze. Snow lay thick across the home counties. And in Whitehall, behind heavy oak doors, officials of the Ministry of Food had been preparing quietly for months. They knew what was coming. They had seen what had happened in the First World War, when German submarines had very nearly strangled the country by sinking the merchant ships that brought food across the Atlantic. They were not going to let it happen again. And so, on the 8th of January, 1940, rationing began. Bacon first, butter, sugar. Each person in the country was entitled to 4 ounces of bacon a week, 4 ounces of butter, and 12 ounces of sugar. It does not sound like much, and it wasn't. A rasher of bacon was a substantial thing. Then 4 ounces might be 3 or 4 slices, perhaps 4 if the butcher was generous. 12 ounces of sugar for a week of tea and baking and jam making was a tight allowance. But it was only the beginning. Meat came next in March of that same year. Then tea in July. Margarine, cooking fat, cheese, which began at a single ounce a week, barely enough to cover a cracker. Eggs, which were rationed to 1 per person per week, sometimes fewer. Jam, treacle, syrup, biscuits, dried fruit, breakfast cereals, rice, canned fish, canned fruit, condensed milk, chocolate, sweets. And then, most painfully for a nation of bakers, in July of 1946, more than a year after the war had ended, even bread was added to the list. 14 years, this would last. 14 winters, 14 Christmases, 14 children's birthdays, celebrated with cakes made from whatever could be scraped together. 14 years of queues, of coupons, of making do. And the extraordinary thing, the thing that still astonishes historians today, is how calmly, how patiently, how with what quiet dignity the British people bore it. There was grumbling, of course. There is always grumbling. There is nothing quite so British as the grumble. But there was no rebellion, no serious protest, no black market that ever grew large enough to undermine the system. The people queued, and the people made do, and the people kept calm and carried on, because that was what one did. But let us not pretend it was easy. Let us not look back through the warm haze of nostalgia and imagine it was somehow a simpler, happier time. It was not. It was hard. It was dreary. It was, for many, a long grey corridor of a decade in which the bright promises of victory turned slowly into the grim reality of peace. Because here is the thing that surprised people most. Here is the thing that even now seems almost impossible to believe. Rationing did not end with the war. It got worse. When the German surrender was signed in May of 1945, when Churchill stood on the balcony of the Ministry of Health and the crowds poured into Whitehall waving flags and weeping with relief, most ordinary people assumed that the shortages would now end. The submarines were gone. The bombs had stopped falling. Surely, the food would come flooding back. It did not. Instead, one by one, new items were added to the ration book. Bread, which had held out through the entire war, was rationed in 1946. Potatoes, of all things, the humble British potato, were rationed in 1947 after a terrible harvest failed in the wettest summer anyone could remember. The cheese ration, which had crept up briefly during the war, was cut back again. Sweets, which had been taken off the ration in April of 1949, had to be put back on just 4 months later, because demand had so overwhelmed supply that shops were being stripped bare within hours of opening. There were reasons for this, of course. Britain was bankrupt. The war had cost the nation a quarter of its entire wealth. The great empire was crumbling. India would be gone within 2 years. The dollar reserves that had paid for American food were gone. The merchant fleet, which had lost thousands of ships to U-boats, was half of what it had been. And across the Channel, in a ruined Europe, there were hundreds of millions of hungry people who had been occupied, bombed, or starved for 5 terrible years, and who needed to be fed from the same shrinking pool of food that Britain was drawing upon. And so the queues continued. The coupons continued. The ration book remained in the kitchen drawer beside the coal chit and the clothing coupons, and was pulled out at every trip to the shops. A generation of children grew up never knowing what a banana looked like. A generation of mothers grew up making birthday cakes without icing because the sugar could not be spared. I want to tell you about one of those mothers now. Her name was Edith Bennett. She lived in a small terraced house on a quiet street in Birmingham, and she was, by 1947, 34 years old, the mother of 3 children and the wife of a man who had come home from the war with one arm and a tremor that made it difficult for him to hold a teacup steady. Edith was not famous. You will not find her name in any history book. But Edith is worth knowing, because Edith is every British woman of that generation. And her kitchen, on a cold Tuesday morning in January, is a window into what rationing actually meant, not on the grand scale of government ministries and shipping tonnages, but in the small, daily, grinding reality of ordinary life. Edith rose at 6. The house was cold. Coal was rationed too, and had been since the war, and there was a careful arithmetic to be done each morning about how many pieces to put on the kitchen fire and how many to save for the evening. When the children would want to do their homework in the warmth, the kitchen was small, a narrow room at the back of the house, with a scullery beyond it and a little garden beyond that, where Edith grew vegetables in the neat rows she had learned to plant during the Dig for Victory campaign. She put the kettle on. Tea was 2 ounces a week per person, which meant that in the Bennet household of 5 souls, Edith had 10 ounces to make last 7 days. She had calculated long ago, in the early years of the war, that this worked out to about 1 good pot of tea per day, or several very weak ones. She chose, most days, 1 good pot made strong, and reused the leaves for a second, paler brew in the afternoon. While the kettle boiled, she took down the ration books from the shelf above the sink. 5 books. 1 for her, 1 for her husband George, and 1 each for the 3 children, Margaret, Billy, and little Susan, who was just 4. Each book had that week's coupons neatly arranged. The butter coupons, the bacon coupons, the meat coupons, which were measured not in weight but in value, 1 shilling and 2 pence per person per week, which might buy you a small joint or a string of sausages, depending on the butcher's mood and the week's supply. Edith planned her shopping with the precision of a general planning a campaign. She kept a little notebook beside the ration books, and in it she wrote down each Sunday evening exactly what she would buy and from which shop on which day. Monday was the butcher. Tuesday was the grocer. Wednesday was the greengrocer, where one could get whatever vegetables were in season. No ration required, thank goodness. And Thursday was the baker. Fridays were for fish, if the fishmonger had any, which he often did not. And Saturday was for whatever one had been unable to get during the week, and for the long, patient queue at the sweet shop where the children's meagre sweet ration could be redeemed. She drank her tea, standing at the kitchen window, watching the grey light come up over the rooftops. In the garden, the cabbages were showing frost on their outer leaves. The hens, which she had kept since 1940, and which were officially registered with the Ministry of Food, scratched at the cold earth. A registered hen keeper could keep the eggs her hens produced, but in exchange had to give up her egg ration. Edith had done the calculation carefully and decided it was worth it. Her 3 hens produced between them perhaps a dozen eggs a week in summer and 4 or 5 in winter. The family ration would have been 5 eggs a week, 1 each. The hens, even in their worst weeks, did better than that. At 8, she roused the children. Margaret, who was 11, dressed herself and came down to help with the younger ones. Billy was 7 and wild as a hare. Susan, at 4, still needed help with her buttons. Edith laid out their breakfast on the kitchen table. A slice of bread each, toasted on the fire, with a scrape of margarine and a spoonful of the precious homemade jam she had bottled in the autumn from the blackberries the children had picked along the canal. A cup of weak, milky tea for each of them. An egg shared between the 3, scrambled with a little milk to stretch it further. They did not complain. They did not know any different. Margaret, who had been born in 1936, could just barely remember a time before rationing, a time of oranges at Christmas and bananas in a fruit bowl and proper butter, thick and yellow, spread generously on her bread. But Billy and Susan had never known such things. To them, this was simply what breakfast was, what food was, what life was. After the children had gone to school, Edith did the washing up, swept the kitchen, and took down her coat and hat from the peg in the hall. Her shopping basket was already packed. Ration books, notebook, purse, a string bag folded flat for anything loose, because the shops had not had paper bags to spare since 1941. She put on her gloves, patched at the fingertips with careful darning, and she set out for the high street. The walk took 15 minutes. Past the terraced houses, past the bombed site at the corner where the German bomb had fallen in 1942, and where now the brambles grew in tangled heaps over the broken bricks, past the primary school, past the little park where old men played balls in summer, and then onto Lodge Road, the high street, where the shops stood in their familiar row, their windows still sparse, their goods still modest, but their doors open and their bells ringing as housewives came and went with their baskets on their arms. The queue at the butcher's was already 30 women long. Edith took her place at the end, nodded to Mrs. Hollis from 2 doors down, and prepared to wait. This was not unusual. This was expected. A queue of 30 was a short queue. She had stood in queues of 100 during the worst years of the war. She had stood in queues that had moved so slowly in such bitter cold that her feet had gone numb, and she had not felt them again until she had been home an hour. While she waited, she talked. This was one of the small pleasures of rationing, if one could call it a pleasure. The queues had become the social heart of British life. In the queues, one heard the news before the newspapers printed it. One heard who was ill, who was pregnant, whose son had come home from national service, whose husband had got a new job, whose daughter was walking out with an unsuitable young man. The queues were the village well of the 20th century city. The news that travelled fastest, the news that mattered most, travelled in the queues. On this particular Tuesday, the news in the queue was about the sweet ration. There were rumours, the women said, leaning in, lowering their voices, that it might come off soon. There had been a rumour before back in 1949, and the ration had indeed come off briefly, and then been put straight back on again when the shops had been cleared in hours. No one quite believed the new rumour, but everyone passed it on, because hope, even a fragile hope, was worth passing on. When Edith reached the counter at last, Mr. Carter, the butcher, greeted her by name. He had known her since before the war. He took her ration book, studied the coupons, and told her what he had. "Not much today, Mrs. Bennet. A nice bit of mutton if you fancy it, a few sausages. I can do you a bit of offal, liver or kidney if you'd rather stretch the coupons." Edith chose the mutton and asked him to put aside a bit of suet for her for the pudding she was planning for Sunday. Mr. Carter, who liked Edith, who had known her husband as a boy, wrapped the mutton carefully in newspaper, clipped the coupons from her book, and slipped in a small piece of suet at no extra cost, winking at her as he handed it over the counter. This was how rationing worked in practice in the small daily life of a British street. The coupons were the law. The coupons were the absolute. The butcher could not give you more than the coupons allowed, and the inspectors from the ministry did come round regularly to check the books. But within the law, there were small kindnesses. A bit of suet tucked in, a nicer cut saved for a regular customer, an extra sausage when no one was looking. It was not the black market. It was something older and gentler than that. It was the simple human business of a shopkeeper looking after the neighbours he had known all his life. From the butcher's, Edith went next door to the grocer's. Here the queue was shorter because the grocer had less to sell. Sugar, tea, butter, margarine, cheese, jam, bacon, tinned goods if he had any, which he often did not. Dried fruit at Christmas if one was lucky. Edith handed over her coupons. The grocer, Mr. Pugh, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a perpetually anxious expression, weighed out her week's butter on the scales, 10 ounces, 2 ounces for each member of the family. He wrapped it in waxed paper and laid it in her basket. The sugar, 10 ounces of sugar. The tea, 10 ounces of tea. The cheese, 8 ounces of cheese, which had gone up recently from 6, and which Edith intended to make last with a careful hand. The margarine. The bacon, 4 ounces each, sliced thin. The jam coupon, which she would save for later in the month, because she still had a jar of the blackberry jam on the shelf at home. She paid. She thanked Mr. Pugh. She took up her basket, heavier now, and stepped out into the cold. This is what a day looked like, a Tuesday morning in 1947, multiplied by every housewife in every street, in every town, in every county in Britain, multiplied by every week of every year for 14 long years, a patient, ceaseless labour of feeding a family on scraps and coupons and small kindnesses. A whole nation, fed not by the great abundance that we now take for granted, but by the careful, patient arithmetic of women like Edith Bennet, standing in queues, planning their shopping, stretching their margarine, and making their children's birthday cakes from dried egg and hope. Let us leave Edith now and let us travel forward a few years to see how slowly, how grudgingly, how painfully the rationing began at last to loosen. The first thing to come off the ration in peacetime was clothing. This happened in March of 1949. Clothing had been rationed since June of 1941, when a scheme of coupons had been introduced to ensure that the cotton and wool and leather that Britain needed for uniforms were not squandered on civilian fashion. Every item of clothing had its coupon value. A man's suit was 26 coupons, a dress was 11, a pair of children's shoes was 3. Each person received 66 coupons a year, which meant that most families, most years, got by with a great deal of darning, patching, and turning of collars and cuffs. The lifting of clothing rationing was a small but joyful event. Shop windows, which had been half empty for 8 years, began slowly to fill again. New dresses appeared, new shoes, new hats. It would be another year or two before the selection really became generous, because the textile industry was still recovering, but the principle was established and women up and down the country began, for the first time in a decade, to dream of a new frock without having to count out their coupons. The next thing to come off, also in 1949, was the chocolate and sweet ration. But this, as I mentioned earlier, was a false dawn. The moment sweets came off, every child in Britain and every adult with a sweet tooth descended on the confectioners. Shops sold out within hours. Orders could not be fulfilled. Stocks vanished. By August, just 4 months after the lifting, the ration was reimposed. The sweet ration would not be lifted permanently until February of 1953, when at last the supply had caught up with the pent-up demand of a generation of children who had grown up dreaming of proper chocolate. The end of clothing rationing in 1949. The end of the soap ration in September of 1950. The end of the petrol ration, which had been in place since 1939, in May of 1950, which meant that for the first time in more than a decade, a family could take a motor car, if they could afford one, on a real holiday, without having to account for every mile. These were the small milestones, each one a step towards normality, each one greeted in the newspapers with cautious optimism, and in the kitchens with quiet relief. Then came the great year, 1953, the year of the coronation, when a young queen was crowned in Westminster Abbey, and a weary nation, for a single day, allowed itself to feel hopeful again. And in that year, one by one, the last great items began to come off the ration. Sweets, finally and permanently, in February, sugar in September, eggs a month later. By the spring of 1954, the only items still rationed were the big ones: the fats, butter and margarine and cooking fat, the bacon and ham, the meat, the cheese. And then, at last, in the green days of June and July 1954, Her Majesty's government announced that these two would go. Let me tell you how the announcement was made, because the detail of it is worth knowing. It came in the form of a statement from the Minister of Food, a man named Gwilym Lloyd George, the son of the old wartime Prime Minister David Lloyd George. Gwilym Lloyd George was a Liberal politician who had crossed the floor to serve in the Conservative government, and he had inherited a portfolio that had, for 14 years, been perhaps the most unenviable in Whitehall. To be Minister of Food during rationing was to be the man who say no, no more butter, no more sugar, no more meat, no more eggs, no more sweets. But now, at last, he was the man who said yes. On the 5th of May 1954, he stood in the House of Commons and announced that meat and bacon would come off the ration at midnight on the 3rd of July. There were cheers from the benches. There was a quiet nod from the opposition. The announcement was carried in the evening papers and on the wireless. And across Britain, in kitchens and corner shops and village halls, there was a sound that had not been heard for 14 years. It was the sound of a nation beginning, at last, to believe. The weeks between May and July were a strange, excited interlude. Housewives began to plan meals they had not cooked for a decade and a half. Butchers began to prepare for the first great post-rationing weekend. The meat markets at Smithfield and Chicago and Buenos Aires, which had been regulated and quota-controlled for so long, began to hum with the anticipation of open trade returning. Newspapers ran features on what to cook first. Magazines published recipes for roasts and chops and bacon breakfasts that had been impossible to make in the rationed years. There were skeptics, of course. There were the old men in the pubs who shook their heads and muttered that it would all come back. Just wait, just wait. Rationing would be back by Christmas. There were the housewives who had grown so used to the discipline of the ration book that they were not quite sure what to do without it. There was a whole generation of children, Margaret and Billy and Susan and their millions of playmates, who had never known a world without coupons and who approached the coming change with a kind of wonder. But there was also, overwhelmingly, a feeling of exhausted joy, a feeling that, at long last, the war was truly ending, not the shooting war which had ended 9 years before, but the long, grey, patient war against shortage, against making do, against the queue and the coupon and the careful arithmetic of the ration book. That war was ending, and on the 4th of July, 1954, it would be over. Let me take you now to a small village in the Cotswolds on the evening of the 3rd of July, 1954, the last night of rationing, the last hours of a way of life that had lasted for 14 years. Let me show you what it looked like, what it felt like, what it meant to the people who lived it. The village is called Bourton-on-the-Water, though it could have been any of 1,000 villages from Cornwall to Caithness. It has a little stream running through its centre, crossed by 5 small stone bridges. It has a pub called the Old Man's, and a church of honey-coloured Cotswold stone, and a bakery, and a butcher's shop, and a post office that is also a general store run by a widow named Mrs. Thorne, who has been running it since her husband did not come home from France in 1944. It is a warm evening, the 3rd of July. The sun is just beginning to set behind the low hills to the west, and the stone of the cottages glows pink and gold in the late light. The stream runs clear over its bed of pebbles. A pair of ducks paddle under the arch of the lowest bridge. Children are playing in the water, splashing and shrieking, because it is a Saturday and there is no school tomorrow. In the butcher's shop, Mr. Dawkins is closing up for the day. He has been in this shop for 37 years, having taken over from his father, who took it over from his father before that. He has known every customer in the village by name and by preference. He knows who likes their mutton hung for a fortnight and who cannot abide offal. He has stood behind that counter through 2 world wars and 14 years of rationing. And tonight he is closing the shop, knowing that when he opens it again on Monday morning, he will be able to sell his customers as much meat as they can afford without a single coupon changing hands. He locks the door. He pulls down the blind. He walks across the small square to the old manse, where a quiet crowd has gathered for the evening. The landlord, a large, cheerful man named Perkins, has put on a small celebration. He has laid out plates of sandwiches made from bread he baked himself, filled with ham and cheese and pickle. He has opened a few bottles of wine. He has even, at some expense, procured a box of cigars, which he is offering to the men at the bar. The talk in the pub is of one thing only. Tomorrow, the 4th of July, the day rationing ends. Mr. Dawkins, the butcher, is asked a dozen times what he will have in the shop on Monday. He tells them, "A full side of beef, the first he has had in years. Legs of lamb, pork chops, sausages made to his own recipe, with no restrictions on fat content for the first time since 1940. Bacon by the rasher, not by the quarter pound. Ham on the bone." The women sit in the corner by the window, talking of the meals they will cook of Mrs. Langley, who is 70 and who has not made a proper beef stew in 12 years, is planning to make one on Sunday week, just as soon as her son can get down from London to enjoy it with her. Young Mrs. Partridge, who has a new baby and whose husband works in the market garden, is going to make a proper shepherd's pie with real minced lamb, enough to feed 6 people, enough to have seconds, Mrs. Thorne from the post office is not planning anything in particular, she says. She is just going to walk into the butcher's on Monday and ask for a pound of bacon, and she is going to take it home and fry the whole pound in a pan, and she is going to eat it herself, every rasher sitting at her kitchen table with a fresh white loaf and a pot of strong tea, and she does not care if it takes her all afternoon. There is laughter at this. There is the particular laughter of people who have known each other all their lives, who have shared the long privations of the war and the longer privations of the peace, and who are now, at last, on the edge of something new. There is the laughter of relief. Outside, the light fades from the sky. The swallows swoop over the stream, catching the last of the evening insects. The church clock strikes 9. In the kitchens of the cottages, mothers are putting children to bed. Some of them, as they tuck their children in, are telling them that tomorrow, for breakfast, they are going to have a proper rasher of bacon each, and an egg, and as much bread as they can eat, and no one will have to share. The children, most of them, do not understand why this is such a wonderful thing. They have never known any different, but their mothers know. Their mothers know, and their mothers kiss them good night and go back downstairs to the kitchen, to sit quietly at the table for a moment in the warm summer darkness, and to think, perhaps with a tear in the eye, of all the years that have passed. Up in the village shop, Mrs. Thorne is doing her books. She is checking off the last of the ration coupons, the coupons that her customers have handed in over the past week for their final butter and cheese and bacon. She has a pile of them on the counter, perhaps 200 of them, small squares of paper with the king's head printed on them, or the young queen's head on the more recent issues. Tomorrow she will send them off to the Ministry of Food for the last time. Tomorrow the coupons will be meaningless. Mrs. Thorne, who is sentimental, puts a few of them aside in a little envelope. She is going to keep them. She thinks perhaps one day she will show them to a grandchild and tell the story of what they meant and how hard they had been earned. She closes the shop. She goes upstairs to her small flat above the post office. She makes herself a cup of cocoa, using the last of her sugar ration, because tomorrow she will be able to buy more. She sits by the window and watches the stars come out over the village. She thinks of her husband, who died at Caen 10 years ago, and who never saw the end of the rationing he had fought to end. She thinks of her own mother, who died in 1945, and who never tasted an orange again after 1939. She thinks of all the people she has known, and all the meals she has not cooked, and all the small pleasures that have been postponed for so very long. And then, because she is a practical woman, and because she has a shop to open in the morning, Mrs. Thorne goes to bed. She sets her alarm for 6. She says her prayers. And as she falls asleep in her small room above the post office, in her small village in the Cotswolds, on the 3rd of July, 1954, she is thinking, with a slow smile spreading across her tired face, of bacon frying in the pan and of the long, bright, unrationed morning that lies ahead. The morning of the 4th of July, 1954, dawned clear and warm across the British Isles. It was a Sunday, which some have called a quiet irony, because, of course, no shops would open on a Sunday, and so the great unleashing of meat and bacon and butter would have to wait one more day until the Monday morning. But the country did not mind. The country had waited 14 years. One more day was nothing. And in any case, there was something fitting about it, something proper, that the last day of rationing should be a Sunday, a day of rest, a day of church bells and roast dinners and quiet reflection, a day when a nation could pause together and take stock of what it had endured and what now lay ahead. Let us return to Bourton-on-the-Water, to that small village in the Cotswolds, on that warm Sunday morning. Let us see how it unfolded there, because what happened in Bourton happened with small variations in 10,000 villages and towns and suburbs across the length and breadth of Britain. Mrs. Thorne woke at 6, as she always did. The sunlight was already coming in through the thin cotton curtains of her bedroom window, painting a pale gold stripe across the floorboards. She could hear the swallows already twittering under the eaves. She could hear, faintly, the bleating of sheep from the meadow beyond the church. She lay still for a moment, savouring the quiet, and then she remembered what day it was, and she smiled. She rose. She dressed in her Sunday best, a navy blue dress with a white collar which she had owned for 6 years and which she kept in good repair by careful washing and pressing. She pinned her grey hair up in its familiar bun. She went downstairs to her kitchen and she put the kettle on. While it boiled, she opened the drawer of her kitchen table and took out the ration books. Her own book. The old books of her husband, which she had kept for reasons she could not quite explain. Long after they had become useless, she laid them on the table and looked at them. Small brown books. Pages of coupons, some already cut away, some still intact. The king's head on the older ones, the young queen's head on the newer, stamps and signatures and dates going back to 1940. She sat for a long moment, looking at them. Then she took her own book, the current one, the one she had been using all week, and she turned to the page where the unused meat coupons still remained. 6 coupons, unclipped, enough for 2 weeks' meat ration if she had chosen to use them. She had saved them in the end because she had wanted to go into Mr. Dawkins's shop with empty coupons and buy her first post-rationing joint with pure money and nothing else. That was the small, symbolic pleasure she had promised herself. But now, looking at the coupons, she thought she might keep them after all, as a souvenir, as a reminder. She cut them out of the book carefully with her sewing scissors, and she put them in the little envelope with the others, the ones she had gathered from her customers over the past week. She wrote on the envelope, in her neat round hand, the date, the 4th of July, 1954, and underneath she wrote, the last of the rationing. She put the envelope in the drawer of her writing desk, beside her husband's medals and her wedding photograph, and she closed the drawer gently. She made her breakfast, a slice of toast, thinly buttered, because she was still in the habit of being careful even now. A boiled egg, a cup of tea. She ate standing at the kitchen window, watching the village wake up. She saw Mr. Dawkins, the butcher, crossing the square on his way to the church for Mr. Dawkins was a sidesman, and it was his duty to be there early to help with the hymn books and the collection plates. She saw old Mrs. Langley coming down from her cottage with her stick, tapping slowly along the cobbles, making her careful way to the 8 o'clock service. She saw young Mrs. Partridge with a new baby, wheeling the pram in the direction of the church, the pram having been borrowed from a neighbour, because the Partridges could not yet afford a pram of their own. And above it all, the church bells began to ring, 6 of them, the full peal, ringing out across the stone rooftops and the cottage gardens, ringing down the little stream, ringing up the green slopes of the hills beyond. The bells of 1,000 years of English Sundays, ringing on the first Sunday of the rest of British history, the first Sunday since the peace had truly and completely come. Mrs. Thorne put on her hat, took her prayer book from the hall table, and set off for church. Inside the old church of St. Lawrence, the congregation was already gathering. The pews, worn smooth by centuries of knees and elbows, were filling up with the familiar faces of the village. The vicar, the Reverend Underwood, a thin, kindly man in his 60s with round spectacles and a soft Welsh voice, was in the vestry, putting on his surplice. He knew what he was going to preach about today. He had known for weeks. He had written his sermon on Thursday evening, sitting in his study at the vicarage, and he had revised it carefully on Friday and again on Saturday, because he wanted to get it right. The organ began to play. The congregation rose. The opening hymn was "Now Thank We All Our God," which Mr. Underwood had chosen deliberately, because he thought it was the right hymn for the day. The voices rose up into the high stone vault of the church, a little thin, a little quavering in places, because this was a village of elderly people and young mothers and small children, and the men of fighting age were fewer than they should have been because of what had happened to so many of them in the war. But the voices were true. They were heartfelt. They rose up and filled the old stone walls with the particular music of a country parish church on a summer morning, which is one of the oldest and most beautiful sounds in the world. The Reverend Underwood took his text from the book of Psalms. He read out, in his quiet Welsh voice, the verse that says, "Thou preparest the table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over." And then he looked up at his congregation, at the faces he had known for the 20 years he had been their vicar, and he began to speak. He spoke of the long years. He spoke of the queues and the coupons, and the patient, difficult labor of feeding families through shortage. He spoke of the mothers who had done miracles, and the fathers who had come home from the war to find that the peace was harder than they had expected. He spoke of the children who had grown up not knowing the taste of an orange, and the old people who had died before they could taste such things again. But then, he said, then, his voice rising a little, lifting, growing warmer, then came the slow return of plenty. The clothing ration gone, the petrol ration gone, the sweets, the sugar, the eggs, and now, at last, at long last, the meat, the butter, the bacon, the cheese, all gone, all freed, all returned to us. And tomorrow morning, he said, when the shops open, when our Mr. Dawkins unlocks his door and stands behind his counter without a coupon book in sight, we shall know, all of us, in every parish in the land, that the long table has been laid, that the cup, so long empty, has been filled again, that our God, who has sustained us through the hard years, has at last prepared before us the feast that we have waited for so long. There were tears in the congregation at this, not loud weeping, not the theatrical sort, just the quiet, slow tears of people who have waited a very long time for something, and who now, at last, are receiving it. Old Mrs. Langley wept into her handkerchief. Mrs. Thorne wept silently, looking down at her prayer book. Even Mr. Dawkins, the butcher, who was not a sentimental man, felt his eyes pricking as he listened. The Reverend Underwood finished his sermon. He gave the blessing. The organ played the closing hymn, which was "All Things Bright and Beautiful," and the congregation sang it with particular feeling because it seemed on that morning that all things really were going to be bright and beautiful again, at last. And then they filed out into the sunshine of the churchyard, and they stood in small groups by the old yew trees and the leaning gravestones, and they talked as country people do after church. They talked of the sermon, which had been a good one. They talked of their plans for the week. They talked most of all of what they would buy from Mr. Dawkins in the morning, and of what they would cook, and of who was coming to visit them, and of how good it was, how very good, to be standing in the sunshine on the first Sunday of a world without coupons. Let us leave them there. Let us leave Bourton-on-the-Water standing in the summer morning, with the church bells silent now, and the sheep bleating in the meadow, and the stream running clear through the centre of the village. Let us travel north, because the ending of rationing was not only a thing of villages and vicarages, it was a thing of cities too, of the great industrial hearts of Britain, of Manchester and Leeds and Newcastle and Glasgow, where the housewives of the terraced streets had endured the shortages as patiently as any woman in any Cotswold cottage, and where the morning of the 5th of July would dawn with no less anticipation. Let us go to Manchester, to a particular street in the district of Ancoats, on the northern side of the city centre, a street of red brick terraced houses built in the 1880s for the workers of the cotton mills. A street called Blossom Street, though there were no blossoms anywhere upon it, because the soot of 100 years of industry had blackened every wall and every window ledge and every cobble of its gutters. On Blossom Street lived a family named Hargreaves. Arthur Hargreaves, 42 years old, a fitter at the Crossley Engine Works. Nellie Hargreaves, 39, his wife, and their 4 children, Ronnie, Tom, Pat, and little Joan, ages ranging from 15 down to 5. They lived at number 43 Blossom Street, in a 2-up, 2-down terrace with an outside toilet in the yard, and a tin bath that hung on a nail in the kitchen, and was brought in and filled with kettles of hot water on Saturday nights, when each member of the family in turn would have their weekly bath, the water growing progressively greyer and cooler as the evening went on. Nellie Hargreaves had been rationing for her family since Ronnie was a baby. She did not know now how to cook without counting. The arithmetic of coupons and ounces and weeks had become so deeply embedded in her mind that she could no more stop doing it than she could stop breathing. She planned every meal in her head 3 days in advance. She knew exactly how many slices could be cut from a loaf of bread, and how many of those slices could be buttered, and how many would have to go dry. She knew how far a pound of sausages would stretch among 6 people, which was not very far at all, but she could make them go a little further by adding breadcrumbs and chopped onion and a pinch of sage, and calling the result a sausage loaf, and serving it with gravy. On the Sunday morning of the 4th of July, Nellie was up at 5. Arthur was on the early shift at the engine works, and she had to give him his breakfast before he left at 5:30. She fried him a piece of bacon, thin, and an egg, and made him a pot of tea, strong as he liked it. She sat with him at the kitchen table while he ate. They did not talk much. They did not need to. They had been married for 18 years, and the talking between them was done in small glances and half smiles, and the passing of the sugar bowl. Before he left, Arthur said, "Well, Nell, this time tomorrow." And Nellie said, "Aye, this time tomorrow." And that was all they said, but they both knew what it meant. This time tomorrow, Nellie would walk down to the butcher's on Pollard Street, and she would buy as much bacon as she could afford, and there would be no counting and no coupons, and Arthur would come home from his shift to a breakfast the like of which he had not seen since before the war. Arthur put on his cap. He kissed Nellie on the forehead. He went out into the soot-grey dawn of Ancoats, his lunch pail in his hand, and he set off for the engine works. Nellie did not go back to bed. She cleared the breakfast things, washed the plates in the stone sink, and then she sat for a moment at the kitchen table, looking at her ration books. 6 books. Arthur's, her own, and one for each of the 4 children. She looked at them, and she thought of all the mornings she had sat at this table with those books and done her sums. All the evenings she had sat at this table planning the week's meals around what the coupons would allow. All the years. It did not seem real that it was ending. She put the books back in the tin on the mantelpiece where they lived. The tin was an old biscuit tin that had once held shortbread given to her by her sister-in-law at Christmas in 1938. On the lid was a picture of a Scottish lassie in a tartan shawl holding a plate of shortbread out to the viewer. The tin was dented and scratched now. Nellie had held it in her hands 1,000 times. 10,000 times. She put it back on the mantelpiece and she thought, "I shall keep you. I shall keep you for the rest of my life. And when I am an old woman, I shall show you to my grandchildren. And I shall tell them what you held." The children began to wake. Ronnie first, who was 15 and who was starting work at the same engine works as his father next month, the day after he left school. Then Tom, who was 12, and Pat, who was 9, and finally little Joan, who was 5, and who came padding down the stairs in her night dress, her hair sticking up in every direction, rubbing her eyes with her small fists. Nellie made them their breakfast. Porridge, because there was no bacon to spare, Arthur having had the last of the week's ration. A slice of bread, each with a little margarine, a cup of watered milk. She sat at the table with them while they ate, and she watched them, and she thought, tomorrow I shall give each of you a proper breakfast, a rasher of bacon, a fried egg, as much toast as you can eat tomorrow. She did not say it. She did not want to get their hopes up in case somehow it did not happen. In case the government changed its mind, which governments sometimes did. In case there was some delay, some problem at the docks, some last-minute crisis that sent them back to the coupons. Nellie had learned over 14 years not to count her chickens. But she thought it as she watched her children eating their porridge. She thought it very hard. After breakfast, she sent the older children to get ready for Sunday school. They protested, as they always did. Ronnie was too old for Sunday school now, he said, and Tom said he was too old as well, though he was not. And Pat said she had a headache, which she had not. And little Joan said nothing because she rather liked Sunday school, where the teacher, Miss Ainsworth, gave out colored pictures of Jesus to any child who could recite the week's verse correctly. Nellie put them into their Sunday clothes, scrubbed their faces with a flannel, combed their hair, Pat's with the particular firmness it required, because Pat's hair was thick and tangled, and fought back against any attempt to tame it. She gave them each a halfpenny for the collection, which she had saved for the purpose, and she sent them off down Blossom Street to the chapel on the corner. And then, for a rare hour, Nellie Hargreaves was alone in her kitchen. She made herself a cup of tea. She sat at the table. She opened the newspaper which Arthur had brought home the night before, the Manchester Evening News of Saturday, the 3rd of July, and she read through it slowly. There were articles about the end of rationing on every page. Recipes for roast beef, which the paper recommended should be cooked for 20 minutes to the pound and served with Yorkshire pudding. Advice on how to choose a good joint. Interviews with butchers across the city, all of whom were preparing their shops for the Monday morning rush. Photographs of children holding up ice creams, children holding up bananas, children holding up bars of chocolate, all grinning into the camera as if they had won the pools. There was also, on page 5, a longer piece written by a woman journalist about what rationing had meant to the housewives of Britain. Nellie read this piece slowly, word by word. The journalist wrote of the queues and the coupons and the careful labor of making meals out of almost nothing. She wrote of the quiet heroism of the ordinary woman, the mother, the wife, the grandmother, who had fed her family through 14 years of scarcity without a word of complaint. She wrote of the particular wisdom that the rationing years had taught, the wisdom of thrift, the wisdom of making do, the wisdom of knowing that plenty, when it came, was not to be taken for granted. Nellie read this piece, and then she folded the newspaper and put it on the table. She sat for a long time looking at the wall opposite, at the calendar that hung on a nail above the dresser, at the picture on the calendar which was a view of the Lake District in autumn, Windermere, with the trees all russet and gold around it. She thought of her own mother, who had died in 1943 in the Manchester Blitz, killed by a bomb that had fallen on the house where she was visiting her sister. She thought of her mother's kitchen in the years before the war, and the smell of bread baking, and the great jar of dripping that had always stood on the shelf beside the bread bin. She thought of her mother's Sunday roasts, a leg of lamb or a joint of beef, and the table laid with a white cloth and the best china, and the family all gathered around, and her father carving with his long knife. All of that had gone in the war. The mother, the house, the Sunday roasts, the easy abundance of a working family's life before rationing had changed everything. Nellie could not get them back. No end of coupons could bring her mother back. No Monday morning at the butcher's could return the kitchen of her girlhood. But tomorrow, she thought, tomorrow she would at least begin to build something for her own children that would be a little closer to what her mother had given her. A proper breakfast, a proper roast on Sundays, a proper treat on a birthday, the small abundance of a family that was no longer, at last, counting every ounce of butter on a little brown coupon. She wiped her eyes with the corner of her apron. She stood up. She had work to do. She always had work to do. She set about her Sunday morning tasks, washing the kitchen floor with a bucket of soapy water and a scrubbing brush, black leading the grate of the kitchen range, polishing the brass fender around the fireplace until it shone. The house had to be clean. Sunday dinner had to be cooked. Life went on. Let us leave Nellie there, on her knees, on the kitchen floor of number 43 Blossom Street, scrubbing the step as her mother had scrubbed it before her. Let us rise up over the red brick roofs of Ancoats and travel south down the long spine of England, and let us go to London. Let us go to the capital to see what was happening there on that strange sunlit Sunday of the 4th of July, 1954. London, on that Sunday morning, was beginning to stir. The great city, still bearing the scars of the Blitz in 1,000 bombed sites and broken buildings, was nonetheless alive with a particular bustle of a summer Sunday. The buses were running, though on their reduced Sunday timetable, the underground was running. In Hyde Park, families were already arriving to spread their blankets on the grass and to feed the ducks on the Serpentine. In Trafalgar Square, the pigeons were wheeling around Nelson on his column. Along the embankment, the tour boats were starting up their engines for the first trips of the day down to Greenwich. In a small flat in Pimlico, not far from Victoria Station, a journalist named Harold Fletcher was working at his typewriter. Harold Fletcher wrote for one of the national newspapers, a morning paper with a large circulation, and he had been given the assignment of writing the main feature for Monday's edition. The feature was to be about the end of rationing. It was to be the lead item on page 3, with a large photograph above it of a butcher's shop window full of meat, and it was to run to 2,000 words, and Harold Fletcher had been working on it, off and on, for 3 days. He had interviewed butchers. He had interviewed housewives. He had interviewed civil servants at the Ministry of Food. He had been down to Smithfield Market at 4 in the morning to watch the first unrationed meat come in off the lorries. He had the facts. He had the colour. He had the human interest. What he was struggling with at his little typewriter in his Pimlico flat on that Sunday morning was the opening, the first paragraph, the way in to a story that, he felt, was bigger than he quite knew how to handle. He had made 3 attempts already. Each of them he had torn from the typewriter and balled up and thrown into the waste paper basket beside his desk. The basket was beginning to overflow. He made himself another cup of coffee. He lit another cigarette. He sat back in his chair and looked out of the window over the grey Pimlico rooftops to where the great chimneys of Battersea Power Station rose in the distance, pumping their slow pale smoke into the summer sky. Harold Fletcher was 48 years old. He had been a journalist since he was 18. He had covered the abdication of Edward VIII, the coronation of George VI, the declaration of war, the Blitz, the Normandy landings as an accredited correspondent, the liberation of Paris, the fall of Berlin, and the long, dreary peace that had followed. He had written, in his time, millions of words about wars and kings and politicians and disasters. But he had never written, he realized, a piece that was quite like this one. A piece about the ending of an era that was itself made of small and quiet things. A piece about the coupon and the queue and the ration book. A piece about the long patience of ordinary people which was finally being rewarded. He put out his cigarette. He sat up in his chair. He wound a fresh sheet of paper into his typewriter. And he began at last to write. He wrote of a small brown book, of its worn corners, of its pages of unused coupons, of the 14 years it had lived in the kitchen drawers and the shopping baskets of Britain, of what it had meant and what it now, at last, no longer meant. He wrote slowly, carefully, choosing his words as a craftsman chooses his tools. He wrote of Edith Bennet, though that was not her real name, of a woman he had interviewed in Birmingham who had stood in a butcher's queue every Tuesday morning for 14 years. He wrote of Mr. Carter, a butcher, though that was not his real name either, who had known his customers by name, and who had slipped small kindnesses into their shopping baskets in the long, hard years. He wrote of the children who had never tasted a banana. He wrote of the mothers who had baked birthday cakes out of dried egg. He wrote of the grandparents who had died before they could taste plenty again. And then he wrote of tomorrow, of the shops opening on Monday morning with full counters for the first time in a decade and a half, of the housewives who would walk in and buy, with money alone, the meat and butter and bacon that had been for so long beyond their reach, of the children who would come home from school to find proper meals waiting, of the grandparents, the ones who were still alive, who would sit at last at well-laden tables and know that the long privation was over. He wrote for 2 hours without stopping. When he had finished, he had 3,000 words, 1,000 more than he had been asked for. He read them through carefully, and he cut, and he polished, and he cut some more, until he had 2,050, which he thought his editor would accept. He pulled the pages from the typewriter. He laid them in order on his desk. He felt, for the first time in his long career, that he had written something that might be read and remembered by people who were not journalists and who did not care about the daily run of the news. He felt he had written something for the ordinary people, for the Edith Bennets and the Nellie Hargreaves and the Mrs. Thornes of the country, for the women who had carried the 14 years on their shoulders and who tomorrow morning, at last, would be laying that burden down. Harold Fletcher put on his jacket. He took the pages of his article, folded them into a large envelope, and he set out for Fleet Street, where the presses of his newspaper would receive them in time for the Monday edition. And so the Sunday passed, the long, warm, still Sunday of the 4th of July, 1954, the last Sunday of rationed Britain. The hours unwound slowly, as Sundays do, across the green fields and the grey cities, across the coasts and the hills and the river valleys of a country waiting quietly for morning. In Bourton-on-the-Water, the afternoon was given over to the small pleasures of a country Sunday. Families walked beside the stream. Children fed the ducks with crusts of bread saved from lunch. Old men dozed in deck chairs in their gardens. The Reverend Underwood, his work for the day completed, sat in his study at the vicarage and wrote letters to his children, who were grown now and living in other parts of the country. He wrote to his son in Bristol, and his daughter in Edinburgh, and another daughter in Cardiff, and he told them all about the sermon he had preached that morning, and about the end of rationing, and about how he had seen old Mrs. Langley weeping in her pew, and how it had moved him more than he had expected. In Manchester, on Blossom Street, the Hargreaves family ate their Sunday dinner together. It was a modest meal, this last rationed dinner. A small piece of brisket, stretched with onions and potatoes, and a spoonful of flour to thicken the gravy. A few carrots from the allotment. A steamed pudding for afters, made with the last of the week's suet. They ate it at the kitchen table, all 6 of them, Arthur at one end and Nellie at the other, and the 4 children ranged along the sides. They talked and laughed, more than usual, because there was a holiday feeling about the day, a sense that something was about to change, even if the children did not quite understand what. After dinner, Arthur took the boys out to the park. Nellie washed the dishes, with Pat helping to dry, and little Joan sitting on the kitchen floor playing with the wooden clothes, pegs from the peg bag, which were her favourite toys. Nellie, as she washed, sang to herself. An old song, one her mother had sung. She had not sung in a long time, she realized. Not for years, not properly. She stopped, a plate in her hand, and she thought about it. She thought, I have not been a singing woman these last 14 years. I have been too careful, too tired, too busy counting. But I used to sing. My mother used to sing. And tomorrow, perhaps, I shall be a singing woman again. In London, in his small Pimlico flat, Harold Fletcher returned home from Fleet Street in the late afternoon. He had delivered his article. The editor had read it in his presence, pencil in hand, nodding slowly as he read, making only 2 small corrections. Good piece, Harold, the editor had said, handing it back to the sub-editors. Good piece of work, takes a light touch, that sort of thing. You got it right. Harold Fletcher, who did not often hear praise from his editor, who indeed almost never heard praise from anyone, had walked back to Pimlico in a warm glow of satisfaction, and had bought himself, on the way, a small bottle of whisky at an off-license, which he intended to open that evening with his supper. Across the country, similar scenes were playing out. In the great cities, and the small villages, in the suburbs and the coastal towns, in the mining valleys of South Wales and the fishing ports of Scotland and the rolling farmland of East Anglia, the people of Britain were spending their last rationed day in the small, quiet business of being alive. They were walking in parks. They were visiting relatives. They were writing letters. They were reading the newspapers. They were making plans for the morning. The evening came slowly. The long summer evening, with its lingering light, its pale sky that would not quite go dark until 10 o'clock at night. The swallows swooped low over the fields. The church bells rang for evensong in 1,000 country parishes, and the faithful gathered for the last service of the day, and sang their hymns, and heard their prayers, and went home again through the dusk. At last, the night came. The stars came out. The lights went off in the bedroom windows of Bourton-on-the-Water, one by one. The lights went off in the back-to-back terraces of Manchester, in the flats of London, in the fishermen's cottages of Cornwall, in the mansion houses of Edinburgh. The country went to bed. The country closed its eyes, and when it opened them again, it would be a different country. Monday morning, the 5th of July, 1954, the first morning. Let us begin in Bourton, where we have been before. Let us go to the butcher's shop of Mr. Dawkins on the little square by the stream. Let us arrive early at 7:30, because that is when Mr. Dawkins has risen this morning, half an hour earlier than his usual time, because there is much to do. Mr. Dawkins let himself into the shop through the back door, which opened off a narrow alley behind the row of shops. He went through into the cold store, which was a small room tiled in white, lit by a single electric bulb, and he looked at what had arrived from the wholesaler on the Saturday evening. A whole side of beef hanging from its hook, 2 legs of lamb, a side of pork, a great coil of sausages, fresh made, a basket of offal, liver and kidney, and sweetbreads, a tray of bacon rashers already cut from the back of the pig, a ham on the bone. He looked at it all, and he smiled. He had not had a cold store like this since 1939. He took down his long white apron from its peg. He tied it around his waist. He put on his straw boater, which he always wore in the shop, the mark of a butcher in the old tradition. He took his sharpening steel from the drawer, and he ran his knives over it, one after another. The long, clean singing of steel on steel, that was the particular music of a butcher's morning. He opened the side of beef first. He brought it through into the shop, carried on his shoulder, wrapped in muslin, and he laid it out on the great wooden block in the centre of the floor. The block was scarred and channelled with the cuts of 40 years of work, his own 40 years, and his father's before him. He took up his cleaver, a heavy one with a beech handle polished smooth by countless grips, and he began to break down the carcase into its cuts, the top side, the silver side, the rump, the sirloin, the fillet, the brisket, the shin. He worked quickly and surely, his hands knowing the work as his eyes knew his own children's faces. The meat, dark red, marbled with yellow fat, fell away in great clean pieces under the cleaver and the long knife. He worked on in silence, as he always did when he was cutting. The sun came up over the rooftops opposite and struck into the shop window. Mr. Dawkins laid out the cuts on the marble slab of the window display, arranging them with the particular care of a man who had not had a proper window to dress in 15 years. The joints went at the back, standing up. The chops and the smaller cuts came forward. The sausages, in their great glossy coils, were laid in the middle. The bacon was arranged in a fan on a white enamel tray. The ham, pink and glorious, took pride of place in the centre of the window. By 8:30, the window was dressed. Mr. Dawkins stood back and looked at it. It was, he thought, without vanity, the finest shop window he had ever arranged. It was the window his father would have been proud to have put out in the good years before the First War. It was a window that spoke of abundance, of plenty, of the old pre-rationing world coming back at last to the small square of a small village in the Cotswolds. Outside, on the pavement, a queue was already beginning to form. Not a long queue, not yet, because it was early, but there were 6 or 7 women standing there already, in their coats and hats, with their baskets on their arms, looking in at the window. One of them, Mrs. Thorne from the post office, had tears in her eyes. She had closed her own shop for the hour because she was not going to miss this, not for all the post office business in Gloucestershire. Another, old Mrs. Langley, leaned on her stick and peered through the glass and murmured to her neighbour, "Look at it, Hilda. Look at the ham. Did you ever see such a ham?" Mr. Dawkins unlocked the door at 9 o'clock precisely. The little brass bell over the door rang its familiar ring. The women filed in, one by one, taking their places in a neat queue along the wall. They were polite. They were cheerful. They were, many of them, a little shy, because none of them had bought meat without coupons, since before some of them had been married. Mrs. Thorne was first. She had been first in the queue deliberately. She had come at 8:30 to make sure of it. She stepped up to the counter, and she set her basket down, and she looked at Mr. Dawkins and Mr. Dawkins looked at her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then Mrs. Thorne said, "I should like, please, Mr. Dawkins, a pound of your best bacon, a whole pound, and I shall pay you with money alone, and with no coupons whatsoever, because I have no coupons, and I do not intend to have any coupons ever again." Mr. Dawkins nodded gravely. He said, "A pound of my best bacon, Mrs. Thorne," coming right up. He weighed it out on the scales. A full pound. He wrapped it in greaseproof paper, and then in newspaper, and he tied it with string, and he laid it in her basket. She paid him. The coins clinked on the marble counter. There was no ration book. There were no coupons. There was only the money and the bacon and the quiet, disbelieving smile on Mrs. Thorne's face as she picked up her basket. She turned to leave. She walked towards the door, and then, halfway there, she stopped. She turned back. She said, To Mr. Dawkins, to the other women in the queue, to the whole small shop, thank you all, thank you, God bless you. And she went out, the bell ringing behind her, into the sunshine of the square, with her pound of bacon in her basket. The other women watched her go. Then they looked at each other, and they looked at Mr. Dawkins, and for a strange moment, in that small butcher's shop on that July morning, no one quite knew what to do, because the thing that they had all been waiting for, the thing that they had talked about for weeks, had just happened. Mrs. Thorne had walked in, had bought a pound of bacon without a coupon, and had walked out again. The rationing had ended. It had really, truly ended. And they were all now standing in the new world, and they did not, any of them, quite know what to say. It was old Mrs. Langley who broke the silence. She was 83 years old, and she had lived through 2 world wars and 4 monarchs, and she was not a woman who was easily silenced. She stepped up to the counter with her stick tapping on the stone floor, and she said in her clear old voice, "I shall have a leg of lamb, Mr. Dawkins, the biggest you've got. My son is coming down from London on Saturday, and I am going to give him a proper Sunday dinner if it is the last thing I do on this earth." And Mr. Dawkins laughed. He laughed out loud, a great warm laugh of relief and joy. And the women laughed too, all of them, and the ice was broken, and the queue began to move. One by one, the housewives of Bolton-on-the-Water stepped up to the counter of Mr. Dawkins's shop, and they ordered their meat, and they paid with money, and they walked out into the July sunshine with their baskets heavy and their hearts light. And the bell over the door rang, and rang, and rang, for the whole of that long, bright, extraordinary morning. Now let us leave Bolton, because the same scene was playing out in every butcher's shop, in every town and village in the land. Let us go back to Manchester, to Blossom Street, to Nellie Hargreaves, whom we left the night before scrubbing her kitchen floor. Nellie had been up since 5. Arthur had gone to his shift at the engine works. The children were still sleeping. The house was quiet. She had made herself a cup of tea, and she had dressed in her best everyday clothes, a clean dress and a cardigan. And she had put her hair up in its usual bun, and she had taken her purse from the drawer of the dresser and counted the money in it, £3, 7 shillings and 9pence. She had been saving for weeks, putting aside what she could out of the housekeeping, because she wanted to be able to spend properly on this first morning. At 7:30, she left the house. The children were old enough now that Ronnie could see to getting Tom and Pat off to school, and little Joan could stay with Mrs. Entwistle 2 doors down, who would mind her until Nellie got back. Nellie had arranged it the day before. She had wanted her morning clear. She walked down Blossom Street. The early sun was slanting down between the chimneys, and the soot on the bricks glittered in it, and a tram went past on the main road at the end of the street, its bell clanging. Nellie turned the corner onto Pollard Street, where the shops were, and she saw the queue. It stretched halfway down the block. 50 women, perhaps 60, all with baskets, all waiting. The butcher's shop on Pollard Street was run by a family called Stanwick, and old Mr. Stanwick was in the window already, arranging the meat. A great spread of it, more meat than Nellie had seen in one place in her whole adult life. She saw joints of beef and legs of lamb and racks of pork ribs and coils of black pudding and strings of sausages and a tray of liver and a great ham on a white china dish. She stood for a moment and looked at it through the window, and her breath caught in her throat, and she felt, without quite knowing why, that she wanted to cry. She joined the queue. She stood behind a woman she did not know, a young woman with a baby in a shawl, and in front of her came a woman she did know slightly, a Mrs. O'Connor from the next street, who nodded and said good morning. They began to talk, as women in a queue will always talk, about the weather and the prices and the meat they had seen in the window and the dinners they were planning to cook Mrs. O'Connor said she was going to make a steak and kidney pudding, the first proper one she had made in 12 years, because her husband was fond of them and she wanted to surprise him. Nellie said she was going to make a bacon breakfast for Arthur when he came home from his shift, and a proper Sunday roast on the weekend. And for the children's tea tonight, she was going to make chops, pork chops, one for each of them, enough to fill their plates. The queue moved slowly, but no one minded. There was a holiday feeling in the air, a festival feeling. The women passed the time easily, chatting, laughing, swapping recipes, planning meals. Mr. Stanwick, inside the shop, was working as fast as he could, his 2 sons helping him, cutting and wrapping and weighing and taking the money. The door of the shop was propped open in the warm morning, and the smells came out of fresh meat and sawdust on the floor, and the slight metallic tang of the scales. It took Nellie 40 minutes to reach the counter. She did not mind. She had waited 14 years. 40 minutes was nothing. When her turn came, she stepped up to the counter and she looked at Mr. Stanwick, who was red in the face from the pace of the morning, his apron already stained with the work, his sleeves rolled up above the elbows. She said, "Good morning, Mr. Stanwick. I shall have 4 pork chops, please, good thick ones, and a pound of bacon, and a pound of sausages, and a piece of brisket, about 3 pounds, for the Sunday roast." Mr. Stanwick wrote it down on a little pad. He looked up at her. "Anything else, Mrs. Hargreaves?" Nellie thought for a moment. Then she said, and her voice was steady, but there was a quiver underneath it that she could not quite hide. "Yes, yes, Mr. Stanwick. I shall have a pound of the best beef dripping, if you've got it." He had. He weighed it out for her in a little paper cup, dripping. The great treasure of the pre-war British kitchen, which Nellie had not had in her larder for a decade and a half. Beef dripping, for toast, for frying, for spreading on a slice of bread with salt and pepper on a cold morning, the way her mother had given it to her when she was a girl. Mr. Stanwick parcelled everything up. He wrote the total on his pad. It came to £1, 17 shillings and 6pence. Nellie counted out the money from her purse. She took her parcels, which were heavy, and she put them in her basket. and the basket was so heavy that she had to hold it with both hands. She thanked Mr. Stanwick. He nodded at her, and he smiled, and he said, "Enjoy it, Mrs. Hargreaves. Enjoy every bit of it. You've waited long enough." She walked home down Blossom Street. She walked slowly because of the weight of the basket, and also because she did not want to hurry. She wanted to savor it. The weight of real food in her arms, the sun on her face, the feeling which she had not had in so long of a morning's shopping well done, of a pantry about to be filled, of a family about to be properly fed. She let herself into number 43. She set the basket on the kitchen table. She unpacked slowly, one parcel at a time. The chops went into the meat safe. The bacon went on the slab in the pantry. The sausages the same. The brisket, wrapped in its grease-proof paper, went on the cold shelf. The dripping went into a white china dish with a lid which had stood empty in the pantry for so long that she had almost forgotten what it was for. And then she sat at the kitchen table, in her quiet kitchen, with the morning sun coming in through the window, and she put her head in her hands, and she cried. She cried for a long time. She cried for her mother, who had died in the Blitz. She cried for Arthur, who had come home from the war older than his years, with the memory of things he never spoke of. She cried for her children, who had never known a world without coupons. She cried for herself, for the 14 years of careful arithmetic, for the cues, for the making do. She cried in a way she had not let herself cry in all those years, because there had been no time for it and no use in it. And then, after a while, she stopped. She wiped her eyes on her apron. She blew her nose on her handkerchief. She stood up. She went to the meat safe, and she took out the bacon, a whole pound of it, and she took out the frying pan from its hook on the wall, and she lit the gas, and she began to cook. She cooked 4 rashers to start with, just 4. She laid them in the pan, and they began to sizzle, and the smell of them, the rich, salty, meaty, unbearable smell of proper bacon frying, filled the kitchen and went up the stairs and reached into every corner of the house. It was a smell Nellie had not smelled properly in 15 years. It was the smell of her girlhood. It was the smell of Saturday mornings in her mother's kitchen. It was the smell of a world she had thought was gone forever. Little Joan came down the stairs. She was still in her nightdress, and her hair was tangled, and she was rubbing her eyes. She came into the kitchen, and she stopped, and she sniffed the air, and she looked up at her mother with a puzzled expression. "Ma'am," she said, "what's that smell?" Nellie looked down at her youngest child, her 5-year-old daughter, who had been born in 1949 and who had never in her life smelled a pound of bacon frying in a pan. She smiled at her, and she knelt down, and she took the little girl in her arms, and she said, "That, my love, is the smell of breakfast. That is the smell of bacon. And you and I, this morning, are going to sit at the kitchen table, and we are going to eat as much of it as we can possibly eat. until we can eat no more. And they did. Nellie lifted Joan onto her chair. She cooked more bacon, and she fried 2 eggs in the bacon fat, and she made a pot of tea, and she cut thick slices of bread, and she laid it all out on the kitchen table. And the mother and the little girl sat together in the morning sun, and they ate. And Joan's small face grew greasy and smiling as she crammed bacon into her mouth. And Nellie watched her, and Nellie thought, This is what it was all for. This is what we waited for. This is the end. Let us leave Nellie and little Joan at their kitchen table in Ancoats. Let us rise up again over the rooftops of Manchester, over the grey mills and the black canals and the long terraces, and let us travel south once more, down the spine of England, to the capital, to London, to that summer morning in the great city on the 5th of July, 1954, when the newspapers were being delivered to the doorsteps and the shops were unlocking their doors, and the whole vast patient population of the metropolis was stepping out into the first unrationed Monday in 15 years. The newspaper came through the letterbox of Harold Fletcher's flat in Pimlico at 7:20. It fell onto the mat with the familiar soft thud that had marked every morning of his adult life. And Harold Fletcher, who had been awake for nearly an hour already, who had been lying in his bed listening for it, got up at once and went into the hall in his dressing gown and picked it up. He took it into the kitchen. He laid it on the table. He put the kettle on the gas. He sat down slowly, the way a man sits when he is about to do something important and wishes to savor the approach to it. And he opened the paper to page 3. There it was, his article, the headline across the top of the page, in large bold letters, the last coupon. The photograph beneath it, a full 7 columns wide, of a butcher's shop window in Smithfield, loaded with joints and chops and sausages, and then his words, his own words, set in their neat columns of print, running the full length of the page, with his name at the bottom of the 2nd column by our special correspondent, Harold Fletcher. He read it through. He read it slowly, as though he had not written it himself, as though he were reading it for the first time. He read of the small brown book, of its worn corners, of the 14 years it had lived in the kitchen drawers of Britain. He read of Edith Bennet, who stood in the butcher's queue every Tuesday morning. He read of the children who had never tasted a banana. He read of the mothers who had baked birthday cakes of dried egg. And when he came to the end of it, Harold Fletcher folded the paper in half and laid it on the table. And he sat very still for a moment, looking at his hands. He was a man who had written in his time many thousands of articles. Most of them he had forgotten within a week. Most of them had been the daily business of a journalist's craft, the news reports and the feature pieces and the opinion columns that filled the middle pages of the morning papers. But this one, he thought, this one might be remembered. This one might be cut out and pasted into a scrapbook by some housewife in Birmingham, and found again by her granddaughter 50 years hence, and read once more in the warm afternoon of a future century. He hoped so. He hoped that very much. The kettle whistled. He made his tea. He ate his breakfast, which was an egg and a piece of toast with proper butter. The first proper butter he had bought without a coupon the day before at the grocer's on his corner. And then he dressed and he went out because he had an assignment to fulfill. His editor had asked him to go down to Smithfield Market to see what was happening there on the first unrationed Monday, and to file a short piece for the evening edition if anything worth reporting should occur. So Harold Fletcher took the bus to Smithfield. He got off at the top of the Farringdon Road, and he walked down to the Great Market, and he stood for a moment at the edge of it, watching. Smithfield, the old meat market of London, a place that had stood on that same plot of ground, in one form or another, for nearly 900 years, since the days when cattle were driven in from the country lanes of Middlesex to be slaughtered and sold within the walls of the medieval city. A vast iron-roofed hall, painted in the dark greens and reds of Victorian municipal architecture, with rows of columns and arches and stalls stretching away into the shadowy distance. The air thick with a particular smell of a meat market, cold and bloody and faintly sweet, the smell that no amount of sluicing with water could ever entirely banish. And the noise. Oh, the noise of Smithfield on a busy morning. The shouts of the porters carrying carcases on their padded shoulders. The clatter of the butcher's trolleys on the stone floor. The rattle of the lorries unloading at the great doors. The cries of the sellers calling their prices. The slap of cleavers on wooden blocks. The whistling, the swearing, the laughter, the banter of men who had worked in this same place, many of them, since their own fathers and grandfathers, had worked here before them. Harold Fletcher had been to Smithfield many times in his career, as a journalist will, but he had not seen it like this, not since before the war. He walked slowly down the central aisle, his notebook in his pocket, his eyes moving from stall to stall, and he could hardly believe what he saw. Meat everywhere. Sides of beef hanging from hooks, thousands of them in great red and white rows that stretched away on either side. Pigs, whole pigs, their pink skin scrubbed and gleaming, laid out on long marble slabs. Sheep by the hundred, their carcasses neatly arranged. Chickens and ducks and geese, plucked and dressed, piled high in wicker baskets. Offal in great enamel trays. Liver and kidney and heart and tripe, enough to feed a city for a month. He stopped a porter, a big man in a blood-streaked white coat and a flat cap, carrying a side of pork on his shoulder. He asked him what he thought of it, this first day without rationing, and the porter set down his load for a moment and wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, and he said, "Guv'nor, I've been working this market for 28 years, and I've never seen a morning like it. We started unloading at 2 this morning, and we've not stopped since. The stuff's coming in faster than we can hang it. There's lorries queued all the way up to the Angel, waiting to be unloaded. The buyers are going mad. Never seen anything like it. Never." Harold Fletcher wrote it down. He walked on. He stopped at one of the larger stalls, where a salesman in a white coat and a green apron, was taking orders from a queue of butchers from all over London, and he listened to what they were buying. They were buying in quantities that Harold Fletcher had not heard a butcher name since the 1930s. 20 sides of beef, 30 legs of lamb, 100 weight of sausages, 50 pounds of bacon. The salesman wrote it all down on his pad, his pencil flying, and the butchers paid their deposits and went off to arrange for their lorries. And the next butcher stepped up and gave his order, and the whole vast process of feeding London rolled on, unrationed. For the first time since 1939, Harold Fletcher talked to a butcher from Croydon, a stout man in his 50s with a red face and a cheerful manner, who told him that he had been up since midnight, that he had driven his lorry into town at 3 in the morning, that he had been first at the stall of his usual supplier, and that he was buying 3 times what he would normally buy for a week. My customers have been waiting for this day for 15 years, the butcher said. I'm not going to be the man who runs out of meat on the first morning. I'm going to have that shop piled to the ceiling. I'm going to give them whatever they want. And if I sell out by lunchtime, I'll come back and buy more this afternoon. Harold Fletcher wrote it down. He talked to a butcher from Hampstead, who told him that his wife had been crying that morning as he left the house, crying because it seemed so impossible that it was really happening. He talked to a butcher from Bermondsey, who told him that he had put 3 sides of beef into his shop window at 7 o'clock, and by 7:30 there had been 40 women waiting on the pavement for him to open the doors. He talked to an old butcher from Whitechapel who remembered the First War as a boy, and who said to Harold Fletcher in a quiet voice that he had not thought he would live to see this, that he had thought the rationing would outlast him, that he had gone to bed the night before, and he had said to his wife, I am going to see the end of it at last. And she had said, Yes, old man, yes you are. And he had not been able to sleep for thinking of it. Harold Fletcher wrote it all down. His notebook filled up, page after page. By 10 o'clock, he had enough material for 3 articles. He left Smithfield, walking out through the great iron gates into the sunshine of Charterhouse Street, and he stood for a moment and breathed in the cleaner air, and he thought, this is a morning I shall remember. This is the morning I shall tell my grandchildren about, if I ever have any. This is the morning when Britain came back. He walked down the Farringdon Road to Fleet Street, and he went into his newspaper's offices, and he sat down at his desk in the long newsroom, with its green-shaded lamps and its rows of typewriters, and he began to write. He wrote for 2 hours. He wrote of the porters and the butchers and the salesmen and the great unloading of the lorries. He wrote of the old butcher from Whitechapel, who had thought the rationing would outlast him. He wrote of a London that was waking up that first Monday morning to a new and extraordinary abundance, and that was receiving it with a quiet, disbelieving joy. When he had finished, he took the pages to his editor. The editor read them quickly, nodding as he read, and he handed them to the sub-editors for the evening edition. Good work, Harold, he said again. bloody good work. Take the afternoon off, why don't you? You've earned it." Harold Fletcher did take the afternoon off. He walked back along the embankment, past the great grey river with its tugs and its barges, past the statues and the plane trees, past the Houses of Parliament with the Union Jack flying above the Victoria Tower in the warm July breeze. He walked home to Pimlico, and he let himself into his flat, and he sat down in his armchair by the window, and he put his feet up on the stool, and within 5 minutes he was fast asleep. Let us leave him there, the sleeping journalist, and let us travel back out across the city, because the morning was unfolding on that 5th of July in every quarter of London, in every quarter of Britain. Let us go to Bermondsey, to a street of terraced houses near the docks, and let us meet a woman called Gladys Webb. Gladys Webb was 51 years old. She was the wife of a docker named Fred, and the mother of 3 grown children, all of whom had left home and started families of their own. She lived in a small house on Lucy Road, not far from the river, in a street that had been heavily bombed in the Blitz, and that still had gaps in its row of houses where the German bombs had fallen, gaps now filled with weeds and brambles, and the little bombsite flowers that seemed to grow everywhere in post-war London, the fireweed and the ragwort and the buddleia. Gladys had been up since 5:30, because Fred had the early shift at the docks, and she had always given him his breakfast before he left, and she was not going to stop now just because rationing was ending. She had fried him his bacon and his egg, as usual, and made him his tea, and sent him off with his sandwiches in his tin. And then she had sat at the kitchen table in the quiet morning, and she had thought about what she was going to do. She was going to buy, this morning, the ingredients for a proper steak and kidney pie. A pie like her mother had made before the war for Sunday dinners when the family gathered round. Gladys had not made a proper steak and kidney pie for 15 years. She had made imitation ones, stretched with breadcrumbs and gravy and whatever she could find, but not a real one, not with a full pound of steak and a half pound of kidney and a thick golden crust of suet pastry. She had dreamed, she realized, of making such a pie. She had dreamed of it quite often in the thin years, and had always woken up disappointed. Well, today was the day. Today she would buy the meat. Tomorrow she would make the pie. And on Sunday, when her son and daughter and their families came for dinner, as they did every Sunday, she would put it on the table, and she would watch their faces, and she would know in her heart that she had come through. She put on her coat and her hat. She took her basket from the back of the kitchen door. She took her purse from the drawer, where she had been putting aside the shillings and the pennies for 3 weeks now, saving up, because she was determined to buy the best cuts without counting the cost. And she set off down Lucy Road into the warm morning towards the shops on Jamaica Road. The queue at the butcher's stretched right round the corner. Gladys joined it. She stood patiently, her basket on her arm, and she began, as all the women did, to talk to her neighbours in the queue. The woman behind her was a Mrs. Prendergast from Abbey Street, whom Gladys knew slightly from the chapel. Mrs. Prendergast was planning a lamb stew. The woman in front was a young Mrs. Hook, newly married, who was going to buy her first piece of beef as a married woman, a small bit of brisket for her husband's supper. Beyond her was Mrs. Tully, whose son had been killed at Monte Cassino in 1944, and who was going to buy, she said, a piece of bacon and a few sausages, enough for herself because she lived alone now, but she was going to buy them anyway, because her boy had died thinking that one day the rationing would end, and she was going to have a proper breakfast in his memory. The queue moved slowly. The sun rose higher over the street. The women talked and laughed and occasionally fell silent as one or another of them grew thoughtful. There was a feeling in that queue which was not quite like any feeling in any queue Gladys had ever stood in before. It was a feeling of something almost sacred, something that was being done not just by these women on this particular morning, but by millions of women in millions of queues, and which marked, together, the passing of one age and the beginning of another. When Gladys reached the counter at last, she asked for a pound of good stewing steak and half a pound of ox kidney. The butcher, who was a man she had known for 20 years, a man named Joe Perkins, looked up at her with a slow smile, and he said, "Steak and kidney pie, is it, Gladys?" Gladys said, "It is, Joe. It's been 15 years coming, and it's finally going on the table." Joe Perkins nodded. He cut the steak from the silver side, a fine dark red cut with hardly any gristle. He weighed it out, 1.25 pounds. He said, "I'll throw in the extra for luck, Gladys. First pie of the new era." He cut the kidney from a fresh one hanging behind him, trimmed it carefully of its fat and sinew, weighed out his £1/2, and wrapped both parcels together in a single sheet of greaseproof paper. Gladys paid him. She thanked him. She took her parcel and she walked home down Lucy Road with her head held high. And when she got to her kitchen, she laid the parcel on the table, and she opened it, and she looked at the meat inside, and she felt, for a moment, that she had been given back something which had been taken from her a very long time ago, and which she had never quite expected to see again. Let us travel now from Bermondsey across the river. Let us go to the West End, to the great department stores of Oxford Street and Regent Street and Piccadilly, because even there, in the temples of fashion and commerce, the ending of rationing was making itself felt. The food halls of Selfridges and Fortnum and Mason, which had been selling restricted goods for 15 years, were now full of meats and cheeses and delicacies from all over the world, and the windows of the great stores were being redressed that very morning to reflect the new abundance. In the food hall at Selfridges, a man named Edward Morris was at work. Edward Morris was the head of the meat and poultry department and had been in that position since 1946. He had taken over from his predecessor, a Mr. Huntley, who had gone into retirement after the exhausting years of the war. Edward Morris was 44 years old, a tall, thin man with grey at his temples and a very precise manner. He wore a morning coat and striped trousers, as the senior staff of Selfridges had always done, and he carried a slim silver pencil in his breast pocket, which he used to mark off items on his daily order sheet. On this Monday morning, Edward Morris was supervising the greatest display of meat his department had ever put on. He had been planning it for 6 weeks. He had ordered in from the countryside, from the home farms of Wiltshire and Hampshire and Berkshire, the finest joints that could be had. He had received a consignment of South Devon beef from a famous breeder in the West Country, and another of Welsh lamb from a farmer in the hills above Brecon, and a crate of proper Wiltshire bacon from a curer whose family had been in the trade since the reign of Queen Anne. He had also, at considerable expense, had flown in from France a dozen whole ducks, and from Scotland a quantity of grouse, and from Norfolk a selection of chickens that were, he thought, the finest he had ever seen. The display ran the length of the meat hall, a good 40 feet of polished marble and white enamel, with the meat arranged in tiers and pyramids and fans and wreaths, each cut labelled with a small white card in copperplate handwriting, giving its name and its price and its provenance. Edward Morris walked up and down the length of it, tweaking a parsley garnish here, adjusting a card there, stepping back to view the whole effect. He was, though he did not show it, enormously pleased. It was, he thought, the finest meat display in London that morning, and probably the finest in Britain. It was a display which would have done credit to the Selfridges of 1939, before the war had come and changed everything. The doors of the store opened at 9 o'clock. The customers began to flow in. Well-dressed women from Kensington and Mayfair and Belgravia, in their summer dresses and their neat little hats, with their leather handbags and their soft shopping gloves. They came to the food hall, many of them, as their first destination, because they had seen the advertisements in the Times that morning announcing the Selfridges meat display, and they wanted to see it for themselves, and to order what they could carry home, and to place orders for delivery to their houses later in the day. Edward Morris stood at his post near the centre of the display, his pencil in his hand, receiving his customers. He took orders for whole racks of lamb for dinner parties in Belgrave Square. He took orders for fillets of beef for little suppers in Knightsbridge. He took orders for bacon and sausages and chops for the breakfasts of the gentlemen in their clubs. He took orders for ducks and chickens and grouse for country weekends. He wrote it all down in his precise copperplate hand, and he assured his customers of delivery, and he thanked them, and they swept out again into the morning, their errands in the food hall accomplished, their minds already turning to the millinery department or the lingerie department or the lunch they had booked at the Savoy. But even in the fine food hall of Selfridges, with its marble floors and its copperplate cards, the true emotion of the morning did come through. At one point, Edward Morris was attending to an elderly lady, a dowager of perhaps 80 years, who had come in leaning on the arm of her companion, and who was buying a small bit of beef for her Sunday dinner. She had a very quiet voice, and a face of great refinement and age, and she wore a black dress of pre-war cut, and a hat with a veil, and gloves of black lace. She ordered her beef. Edward Morris wrote it down, and then, as she was about to turn away, she paused and she looked up at him with faded blue eyes, and she said, "Mr. Morris, I remember your shop before the war. I remember buying meat here in 1938. I remember the abundance, and I thought I should not live to see it again. But here I am, and here it is, and I want to thank you, Mr. Morris. I want to thank you and all your staff for what you have done this morning." Edward Morris, who was not a sentimental man, who had steered his department through the hardest years of the war with a dry and efficient manner that had sometimes been mistaken for coldness, found that his throat had quite suddenly closed up, and that his eyes were stinging. He bowed to the old lady. He said, in a voice that was not quite steady, "It is my great pleasure, madam. It is our great pleasure, and we are very glad that you are here to see it." She smiled at him. She patted his sleeve with her gloved hand, and then she turned and walked slowly away on the arm of her companion across the polished marble floor of the food hall of Selfridge's on the first Monday morning of unrationed Britain. Edward Morris watched her go. He stood quite still for a long moment, and then he took out his handkerchief and he blew his nose, and he returned to his work. The afternoon of that first unrationed Monday came on slowly, as summer afternoons do. The sun climbed to its height over the rooftops of Britain, and then began, very gradually, to lean towards the west. The shadows lengthened in the streets. The heat gathered in the brick walls and the slate roofs and the dusty pavements. In the parks, the grass grew warm underfoot. In the kitchens of 10 million houses, the housewives who had done their shopping in the morning were now turning to the afternoon's labor, which was the preparation of meals, the putting away of meat into larders and cold boxes, the making of lists for tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. Let us return to Nellie Hargreaves in Coates. We left her at her kitchen table, sharing the first unrationed breakfast with her youngest daughter. The hours since had passed for Nellie in a kind of quiet dream. She had washed up the breakfast things. She had walked round to Mrs. Entwistle's house and collected little Joan, who had not needed collecting after all because Joan had been too full of bacon to want to go anywhere. She had done her housework. She had put the chops into the meat safe carefully, and the brisket on the cold shelf, and the dripping into its white china dish. And she had arranged and rearranged the pantry several times, because she could not quite believe how full it looked. At about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, she began to prepare the tea. Arthur would be home from his shift at 5:30, and the children would be home from school soon after, and Nellie had decided that tonight's tea would be a proper one, the first proper one in 15 years. Pork chops, 4 of them, one for each of the children. A larger pork chop for Arthur, because he had done a long shift and he would be hungry. For herself, she would have a smaller one, because she had already eaten her bacon that morning, and she was, even now, not quite accustomed to plenty and was holding back a little. She peeled the potatoes, a great pile of them, enough for everyone to have as much as they wanted. She cut them into chunks for roasting. She took out the bottle of dripping from the pantry, and she spooned a generous quantity of it into her big black roasting tin, and she put the tin in the oven to heat up. She scraped carrots. She shelled peas from the pods she had bought at the greengrocer's that morning, the first fresh peas of the summer from the Lancashire fields. She put the peas into a pan of water with a pinch of salt and a sprig of mint from the pot on her windowsill. By 5 o'clock, the potatoes were in the dripping, roasting golden. The smell of them filled the kitchen, joined by the smell that was now rising from the frying pan on the stove, where Nellie had just laid the first of the pork chops. She had rubbed them with a little salt and pepper, nothing else. She wanted to taste the pork, the proper, rich, honest taste of English pork, which she had almost forgotten. The front door opened. Ronnie and Tom came in from school, their satchels banging against the door frame, their voices loud in the narrow hall. They stopped, as little Joan had stopped earlier, at the kitchen door. They sniffed the air. Ronnie, who was nearly 15, and who remembered just barely the proper meals of his very early childhood, looked at his mother with wide eyes. "Mum," he said, "is that pork?" Nellie smiled. "It is, love. 4 chops, 1 each, for you and Tom and Pat, and a bigger one for your dad. Go and wash your hands and tell your sister's teas in 20 minutes. The boys clattered upstairs. Nellie turned the chops in the pan. She basted the potatoes. She put the kettle on for tea. Outside, the evening sun was striking down Blossom Street, turning the red brick to a warm rose, and the sparrows were chattering in the guttering of the house opposite. Pat came in from school. She was 9, and she was a thoughtful child, darker and quieter than her brothers. She came into the kitchen, and she stood beside her mother, and she watched the chops frying in the pan. She said, "Ma'am, is it true it's ended, the rationing?" Nellie knelt down beside her. She put her arm around her daughter. She said, "Yes, love, it's true. From today on, we can have as much as we can afford, and you never need to see a ration book again." Pat thought about this. Then she said, "Ma'am, I don't remember rationing not being here. Does that seem strange to you?" Nellie looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she said, very gently, "Yes, love, it seems very strange to me, but you'll see. You'll see in a year or 2 what a world without rationing is like, and you'll wonder how we ever lived the other way." She kissed Pat on the top of her head. She stood up. She turned back to the stove, and she turned the chops again, and Pat went to the sink to wash her hands, her small face thoughtful in the evening light. At 5:30 precisely, Arthur came home. Nellie heard his boots on the step. She heard the front door open and close. She heard the familiar routine of Arthur hanging up his cap, taking off his jacket, setting his lunch pail on the hall table. And then she heard him stop. he had smelled it. He had smelled the pork and the roasting potatoes, and he had stopped in the hall, and she could imagine his face quite clearly, the slow smile, the slight raising of the eyebrows. He came into the kitchen. He looked at the table, which Nellie had laid with her best cloth, a white one with embroidered corners that she had had as a wedding present and had hardly used since the war. He looked at the stove, where the chops were just coming off the heat and being laid on the plates. He looked at his wife. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he came across the kitchen and he put his arms around her, a thing he did not often do, and he held her just for a few seconds, there in the warm kitchen on the first evening of unrationed Britain. "Nell," he said at last, "you've done us proud." Nellie laughed, because if she did not laugh, she would cry. She said, "Go on, you great lump. Sit down and let me feed you." The family sat down together, all 6 of them. Arthur at one end, Nellie at the other, Ronnie and Tom on one side, Pat and little Joan on the other. Nellie served the meal. A pork chop on each plate. A great heap of roast potatoes beside it, golden and crisp from the dripping. A pile of peas, bright green. A spoonful of carrots. Gravy, which Nellie had made from the pan. Juices and a little flour and water. She set each plate down in front of its owner, and she sat down herself at last. And Arthur said grace, as he always did, a short, plain grace of the sort he had learned as a boy. "For what we are about to receive," Arthur said, "may the Lord make us truly thankful. And tonight, Lord, we are truly thankful." They ate. They ate slowly, because the children were unaccustomed to such quantity, and it took them time to get through it. They ate mostly in silence, because what was happening at that table did not need to be spoken of. The only sounds were the clatter of knives and forks on plates, and the pouring of tea, and the occasional murmur of appreciation from Arthur or from one of the boys. The pork was tender. The potatoes were perfect. The peas tasted of summer and of the Lancashire earth they had grown in. And it was all there, all of it, in the quantities the family could actually eat, and no coupon had been cut, and no careful arithmetic had been performed, and no one had to give up anything so that someone else could have it. When they had finished and the plates were clean, Nellie brought out a pudding, a simple one, a rice pudding, baked slowly all afternoon in the bottom of the oven, with a nutmeg grating on top and a skin of brown sugar. She had made it with proper milk and proper sugar, in quantities that a week ago would have cleaned out the family's ration for 10 days. Tonight, it had not touched anything. Tonight, she had simply gone to the dairy and bought the milk, and gone to the grocer's and bought the sugar, and come home and made a pudding, like her mother had made, like her grandmother had made, like English housewives had been making, freely and without coupons, for 1,000 years. After the pudding, Arthur sat back in his chair. He loosened his belt a notch. He said, "Nell, I don't think I've eaten a meal like that since I married you," Nellie said. You haven't. I don't think any of us have. Arthur nodded slowly. He looked at his children around the table, and he looked at his wife, and he said, in a voice that was quieter than usual, "Well, it's a new world, then, isn't it?" And Nellie, gathering up the plates, said, "Yes, love, it is. Let us leave the Hargreaves family at their table, and let us travel out across the country one last time to see how the long day was ending in all the places we have visited. Across the warm evening fields of Gloucestershire, across the rolling farmland of Wiltshire and Hampshire, across the dales of Yorkshire and the moors of Northumberland, across the lowlands of Scotland and the green valleys of Wales. The same scene was being played out in 10 million kitchens. Families sitting down to the first unrationed tea of their lives. In Bourton-on-the-Water, at the vicarage by the church, the Reverend Thomas Underwood and his wife Margaret sat down to a cold collation which Margaret had prepared that afternoon. They did not need a large meal, the two of them. They were of an age when a slice of ham and a tomato and a piece of bread and butter was supper enough, but what they had before them was, for them, a feast. Proper Wiltshire ham, cut thick, a whole plate of it, Margaret's own homemade bread, a pat of yellow butter, a small pickle of onions, a salad of lettuce from the garden, and a jug of cold cider from the local farm, which the Reverend Underwood was particularly fond of. They ate in the cool of the dining room, with the French windows open onto the garden, where the roses were in their full July glory. They spoke of the congregation that morning. They spoke of old Mrs. Langley, who had stood at the butcher's that afternoon. Margaret had heard, and bought a leg of lamb for her son's visit. They spoke of Mrs. Thorne from the post office, who had told half the village about her pound of bacon. They spoke, in the easy, companionable way of a long marriage, of all the small doings of the parish on that remarkable day. And then the Reverend Underwood, refilling his glass of cider, said to his wife, "Margaret, I shall tell you something. I do not know that I have ever, in 30 years of ministry, preached a sermon that seemed to matter so much. When I saw old Mrs. Langley weeping in her pew this morning, I thought, this is what the church is for. Not for the great occasions, not for the coronations and the royal weddings and the state funerals, but for this. For standing with ordinary people at the moments when their ordinary lives turn, for giving thanks on their behalf when the long, hard times at last come to an end." Margaret Underwood, who was a wise woman of 62 and had been married to her husband for 37 years, smiled at him across the table. She said, "Yes, Thomas, that is what the church is for, and you did it well today. You did it very well." In Bermondsey, in Lucy Road, Gladys Webb sat at her kitchen table with her husband Fred. Fred had come home from the docks at 6, tired and dirty as always, and had washed at the sink and changed into his clean clothes, and had sat down to a supper that Gladys had prepared from half of what she had bought that morning. A pound of sausages fried with onions, a pile of mashed potato, rich with butter, a plate of bread and butter on the side, a pot of strong tea. Fred had eaten 3 sausages, which was 2 more than his usual supper, and he had said to Gladys, "I could eat another, old girl." And Gladys had fried him another, and he had eaten that one too. And then he had sat back and he had grinned at her across the table, and he had said, "Well, Glad, that was a supper. That was a proper supper." Gladys had told him while they ate about her plan for the pie, about how she would make it the next day, and about the Sunday dinner she was planning for the family. Fred had nodded and chewed his sausages and listened, and when she had finished, he had said, "Glad, I've been waiting 15 years to eat one of your steak and kidney pies. I've dreamed of it. I have. And I shall tell you something. When you put it on that table on Sunday, I shall weep. I shall weep into my plate. And so will our Billy, and so will our Rose, and so will the grandchildren. We shall all sit round that table, and we shall weep with the joy of it." Gladys had laughed and slapped his arm across the table and said, "Get on with you, Fred Webb, as if you ever wept in your life." But Fred had not been joking, and Gladys, in her heart, knew it. And she thought, as she cleared the plates and put the kettle on for another pot of tea, that she would make that pie the finest one she had ever made, and she would serve it on Sunday with pride, and if Fred wept a little into his plate, well, she would not mind. She might even weep a little herself. In Pimlico, in his small flat, Harold Fletcher woke at about 7 o'clock from his long afternoon sleep. He stretched, he got up, he washed his face at the sink, he put on his jacket, and he went out to the little Italian restaurant on Warwick Way, where he often ate his supper, and he ordered himself a plate of osso buco and a glass of Chianti, and he sat at his usual corner table with the evening edition of his own newspaper propped up against the water jug, and he read, with a slow and private satisfaction, the second article he had written that day, the one about Smithfield Market, which had come out on page 4 of the evening paper under the headline "A Morning at Smithfield" by our special correspondent Harold Fletcher. He read it through. He nodded slowly. It was a good piece. Not as good as the morning piece, perhaps, but a good piece. A journalist's piece. Solid, clean, well observed. He folded the paper. He addressed himself to his osso buco, which was excellent. He thought, "This is a good day. This is a day I shall remember." And he raised his glass of Chianti silently to the ceiling of the little restaurant, and he drank to the end of Rationing and to the beginning of something new. In a food hall of Selfridge's, closed now at the end of the long day, Edward Morris stood alone among his emptied display cases. The meat was nearly all gone. The great South Devon beef, sold. The Welsh lamb, sold. The Wiltshire bacon, sold. The French ducks, the Scottish grouse, the Norfolk chickens, all sold. He had taken more orders than any single day he could remember in the history of his department. His little copperplate pad was full, 2 pads full, of the orders for delivery he would have to begin working through in the morning. He walked slowly down the length of the empty display, trailing his hand along the polished marble. He was alone now. His staff had gone home. The cleaners were in the other departments. The only sound was the distant hum of the refrigeration plant in the cellars. He reached the end of the hall. He stopped. He thought about the old lady who had patted his sleeve and thanked him. He thought about his father, who had worked in the food trade before him and who had died in 1941. He thought, inexplicably, of his mother, who was still alive, who lived in a small flat in Bayswater and whom he visited every Sunday afternoon. He resolved, next Sunday, to take her a leg of lamb, a good one, from the best of his stock. He would carry it himself from the food hall on the Saturday evening, and he would take it to her flat on the Sunday morning, and he would ask her to cook it for him, and they would eat it together at her small dining table overlooking the gardens, just the two of them, as they had done on many Sundays before the war. He turned off the light. He locked the door of the food hall behind him. He walked out through the great store, his footsteps echoing on the marble floors, past the silent counters and the dim chandeliers and the mannequins in their summer frocks. He said good night to the doorman at the tradesman's entrance. He went out into the warm London evening, and he walked slowly home along Wigmore Street, thinking of his mother and of his father and of his life, and of all the strange long patient years that had brought him at last to this quiet particular evening. And in Bourton-on-the-Water, as the last of the light drained from the western sky, Mrs. Thorne closed her post office for the night. She turned the sign on the door to closed. She locked up. She went upstairs to her small flat above the shop. She made herself a cup of cocoa. She sat by the window as she had done the evening before, and she watched the stars come out one by one over the rooftops of the village. But this evening was not like yesterday evening. This evening she was not waiting for something. This evening the thing she had been waiting for had come. The long day had been lived. The bacon had been bought. The meal had been eaten. The rationing had ended. Not in theory. Not as a policy announcement. Not as a headline in a newspaper. But in the real and ordinary life of real and ordinary people in 1,000 villages and 10,000 streets and 10 million kitchens across the country. Mrs. Thorne finished her cocoa. She washed the cup at the sink. She said her prayers as she always did. She thanked God for the day. She thanked God for the bacon and for Mr. Dawkins, who had sold it to her, and for the village, and for her husband, who could not share this day with her, but whom she hoped was watching somehow from wherever the dead go. She got into her bed, and she pulled up the covers, and she closed her eyes. And in the darkness of her small room above the post office, as she drifted towards sleep, she thought one last thought. She thought, we came through it all. The long years, the queues, the coupons, the making do, we came through. And now, at last, at long last, we are free. The church clock struck 11. The village settled into its summer night. Across the sleeping country, a new quiet had descended, a quiet that was not quite like any quiet that had come before. It was the quiet of a nation at rest after a very long labor. It was the quiet of a people who had done what was asked of them for as long as it needed to be done, and who had now, at last, put down their burden. It was the quiet of Britain at the end of the first day of the rest of its history. And so the day ended. The 5th of July, 1954, the first day of unrationed Britain, the day the coupons became history, the day the ration books went into the drawers and the scrapbooks and the memory boxes to be taken out years later by grandchildren who would turn them over in their hands and try to understand what they had meant. Somewhere in a cottage in the Cotswolds, an old woman was asleep, with a smile on her face, dreaming perhaps of her son coming down from London on Saturday, and of the leg of lamb she would put on the table for him. Somewhere in a terraced house in Manchester, a mother and father were asleep side by side, their children asleep in the rooms above, the pantry below them full for the first time in 15 years of honest, ordinary, uncomplicated food. Somewhere in a dockside street in Bermondsey, a docker was asleep with his wife beside him, and in the larder downstairs, £1.25 pounds of good stewing steak and ½ pound of ox kidney sat wrapped in grease-proof paper, waiting for the pie that would be made the next day. Somewhere in a flat in Pimlico, a journalist was asleep with a copy of his evening paper on the bedside table, open at page 4. Somewhere in a flat in Bayswater, a mother was asleep who did not know that her son was planning to bring her a leg of lamb on Sunday, but who would weep quietly when he did, because she too remembered the years before the war. And somewhere, in every county of the land, in every corner of the kingdom, 10,000 small brown ration books lay in 10,000 kitchen drawers, waiting to be put away forever, their work done, their long service ended. They had been the companions of a generation. They had ruled the lives of housewives and the appetites of children. They had shaped, for 14 years, the daily bread of Britain. And now their day was over, and a new day had begun. So ends our story. The story of the day rationing ended. The story of a country that had endured and waited and queued and made do, and that at last came into its quiet inheritance. A country that sat down on the warm evening of the 5th of July, 1954, to its suppers, and that rose the next morning to a world of plenty. A country that was, in many ways, the same country it had always been, and yet, in one particular and extraordinary way, quite utterly changed. If you have listened to this story to its end, then I thank you for your company through the long hours. I hope that the telling of it has been a comfort. I hope that the small lives we have met, Edith and Nellie, Arthur and Gladys, Mr. Dawkins and Mrs. Thorne, Harold, Fletcher and Edward Morris, the Reverend Underwood and old Mrs. Langley, have seemed to you, as they have seemed to me, real and true and worth the remembering. They are all of them gone now, those who were alive in 1954, they and their children and most of their grandchildren. But they lived and they endured and they sat down at last to their unrationed suppers. And their story, I think, is worth the telling. Sleep well. Sleep deeply. Sleep in the knowledge that the long, hard roads, in the end, do come to their endings, and that the morning, however far off it seems, does always, always come. Good night, and God bless you all.